Canada-U.S. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc is headed to Washington this week to try and
What if
advance
America's
talks.
closest allies
Ashley
suddenly
Burke, CBC
turned the
News,
tables,
Ottawa.
cutting trade ties, redirecting exports, and rewriting decades of economic partnership? In a stunning and unexpected shift, Canada has made a bold trade move that's sending shockwaves through Washington. This isn't just another policy change. It's a geopolitical game-changer with massive implications for industries, consumers, and diplomacy. Why did Canada do it? And what does this mean for the future of North American trade? As U.S. lawmakers scramble for answers, tensions are rising fast. Stay tuned as we break down the motivations, consequences, and the global fallout of Canada's dramatic pivot. Introduction. A date, a deadline, and a declaration. August 1st isn't just another mark on the calendar. In the shifting terrain of global politics and trade, it has become a pressure point, an inflection where policy meets power. Every extension of negotiations, every delay in deadlines, every moment of carefully measured patience is not hesitation, but a strategic pause. For Canada, this isn't procrastination. It's a calculated chess move, where the endgame is not survival, but sovereignty. Behind the diplomatic quietude lies a dual message that Canada is sending to the world and to the United States in particular. We prefer peace, but we are prepared for economic war. Unlike the erratic threats often emanating from President Donald Trump's administration, Prime Minister Mark Carney's strategy is precise, coordinated, and proportionate. It is not forged in fury, but honed through reason. Where Trump's method is bluster, Carney's is blueprint. The return of Trump's trade belligerence President Trump, once again, has reignited tensions across the northern border. Claiming that Canada has failed to act in good faith, he announced a sweeping and punishing 35% tariff on all Canadian goods entering the U.S., effective August 1st. Unlike sector-specific tariffs that have rattled industries in the past, this move is different in scope and severity. It's not just economic policy, it's an economic missile. This sudden and sweeping tariff is not merely a transactional escalation. It's a political performance, timed late in the evening, bypassing traditional diplomatic channels, and sent with the force of a declaration. The message is clear. Trump doesn't care for diplomacy, he cares for dominance, and the consequences are immediate and far-reaching. Carney's calculated silence. Strategy, not surrender. As the storm brews, Prime Minister Carney has chosen a path that may appear passive, but is anything but weak. He has spoken sparingly, choosing his words with the precision of a surgeon rather than the scattershot salvos of a showman. Critics interpret his silence as uncertainty, but those watching closely understand. It is resistance, not retreat. While Trump seeks chaos, Carney seeks clarity. The Prime Minister has backed Canadian workers unequivocally. He has pledged to stand by businesses weathering the storm. And most importantly, he has continued to position Canada not as a reactive junior partner, but as a sovereign nation crafting its future. Trump's threats ripple across the globe. It's not just Canada that's reeling. Since Monday, Trump has sent similar tariff threat letters to 20 other nations. Asia is already showing signs of economic stress. Allies like Japan and South Korea have been blindsided. A 15 to 20% blanket tariff policy is now Trump's weapon of choice, and even countries that have not received a letter are bracing for impact. No one is safe under a system driven by unpredictability. This isn't a Canada-specific crisis anymore. This is a full-scale dismantling of the global trade order, one Trump is orchestrating with a mix of arrogance and instability. From retaliation to reinvention, Canada's shift in global strategy. As Trump seeks to bend the global economy to his will, Canada is rewriting its playbook. Under Carney's leadership, the country is building bridges elsewhere. Through expanded EU trade agreements, stronger diplomatic ties in the Indo-Pacific, and diversified exports beyond the U.S. market. This is more than strategic repositioning. It's the birth of a new Canadian identity in world affairs, less dependent on the whims of Washington and more rooted in multilateral alliances, shared values, and economic self-reliance. In a world where U.S. leadership can no longer be trusted, Canada is ahead of the curve. Doug Ford's rallying cry, economic survival mode. As the federal government treads carefully, Ontario Premier Doug Ford has taken a different approach. With fiery rhetoric and decisive action, Ford has declared what amounts to an economic wartime budget. We will spare no penny to protect our businesses, our families, our communities, he says. And he means it. Ford's voice cuts through the national fog like a fire alarm. He's not balancing nuance or international diplomacy. He's focused on protecting Ontario's economic engine from systemic breakdown. Where Ottawa hesitates, Ford is preparing. His urgency underscores one critical truth. Canada is not merely negotiating a trade deal. It is fighting for economic survival. The federal-provincial tug-of-war. The growing disparity between provincial assertiveness and federal restraint is becoming more apparent. Ford's aggressive stance is a challenge to Ottawa. Lead from the front or be pushed by provinces that won't wait. The trade war has begun to fracture political unity at home. In times of crisis, even allies become critics. Carney's ability to rally the provinces under a singular Canadian economic vision will be the true test of his leadership. Without coordination, Canada risks a fragmented response. With it, the nation could emerge stronger and more unified than ever before. Economic war becomes public health crisis. Trump's tariffs aren't just theoretical, they have real-world consequences. In Ontario, 2 critical air ambulances serving Toronto were grounded due to supply chain disruptions caused by U.S. tariffs. Essential parts couldn't get across the border in time. Emergency care was delayed. Lives were at risk. This isn't a trade policy debate anymore. It's a public safety crisis. Tariffs, once viewed as economic tools, are now interfering with health services. They affect hospital supply chains, food delivery networks, and even essential infrastructure maintenance. Trump's war on trade is starting to feel more like a war on ordinary life. A broken rulebook and a foghorn for a negotiator. Negotiating with Trump is like trying to debate a foghorn, loud, erratic, and impossible to pin down. He doesn't follow global trade norms. He doesn't offer clear demands. Instead, he thrives on confusion. This is a textbook psychological operation. Keep the opponent off balance, force them to react, wear them down with unpredictability. But Canada is now asking the real questions. What does Trump actually want? Is it a fair trade deal? Or is it a slow, strategic dismantling of Canada's economic independence? The longer Canada chases temporary relief, the more it sacrifices long-term resilience. The global message, loyalty means nothing. The deeper message of Trump's tactics is chilling. Being a loyal ally doesn't protect you. Canada has negotiated in good faith. It has collaborated on critical issues, from security to the fentanyl crisis, and yet it remains a target. This signals to the world that under Trump, alliances are transactional and temporary. Nations that once saw the U.S. as a reliable partner are now hedging their bets. The result? A global power shift, with Canada charting a new path forward, grounded in diplomacy, law, and collective strength. Economic bullying in a suit. A 35% blanket tariff is not a negotiation tool. It's economic extortion. Trump's offer to adjust the tariff only if Canada refrains from retaliating is not diplomacy, it's blackmail. The message is clear: submit or suffer. This is not how trade works. This is how bullies operate. And Canada, for all its patience, is reaching the end of its rope. The nation is backed into a corner, and with every further escalation, it becomes more obvious that this isn't about trade deficits. It's about control. The rise of the Acanthoponax Fortress, a new economic vision. Doug Ford's vision of an Acanthoponax Fortress isn't just catchy rhetoric, it represents a real pivot in Canadian thinking. It's a recognition that self-reliance isn't just aspirational anymore. It's essential. The fortress metaphor implies strength, independence, and a protective barrier against external threats, economic or otherwise. For Canada, that means reinvesting in domestic manufacturing, securing critical supply chains, building redundancy into infrastructure, and looking east and west instead of always south. From tariffs to transformation, Canada's blueprint. While Trump pens threats, Carney drafts solutions. His recent statement outlines a plan to unite provincial and territorial economies under one coordinated vision. This single Canadian economy isn't a buzzword. It's a structural reimagining of how Canada engages with itself and the world. From infrastructure investment to global trade diversification, the Carney administration is not just patching leaks, it's rebuilding the boat. By aligning national interests across regions and focusing on strategic global partnerships, Canada is positioning itself for post-America resilience. Standing with workers. No longer business as usual. Canada's copper industry, foundational to the nation's economic fabric, is now under siege from U.S. tariffs. The response from Canada's industry minister has been swift and sharp. These tariffs are illegal, and they will be fought. This isn't posturing. It's a legal, moral, and economic stand. Canadian workers are not pawns in a foreign leader's political theater. And Canada, finally, is done playing defense. Introduction. A crisis long deferred. Donald Trump's recent escalation of trade rhetoric and punitive tariff threats has thrown Canadian business and political leaders into turmoil, scrambling to fix problems that, frankly, should have been addressed years ago. But this isn't simply a case of poor planning. It's systemic negligence. Decades of half-hearted enforcement, inconsistent education, and weak internal policy coordination have allowed fault lines to widen. Now, with external pressure intensifying, Canada is forced to confront its internal fractures while fending off trade fire from the south. The lesson is brutal. Trade protections are meaningless without continuous enforcement and comprehensive education. And Canada must urgently fix its internal structure while weathering an external economic storm. The hollow rhetoric versus genuine interdependence. When a prominent figure dismisses Canada's importance, mockingly suggesting, "We don't need Canada," or casually referencing high-grade nickel, potash, and uranium, it reflects more than ignorance. It exposes a political narrative that ignores deep-rooted interdependence. Consider that 57% of high-grade Canadian nickel supports U.S. aerospace, defense, and industrial supply chains. Saskatchewan's potash delivers roughly 87% of fertilizer critical to American agriculture. Canadian uranium fuels nuclear plants across the Great Lakes region, powering millions of homes and businesses in New York, Minnesota, Michigan, and beyond. This isn't luxury, it's foundational. While Trump couches his remarks for political theater, Republican governors, behind closed doors, freely admit that America quietly depends on Canadian resources. That the rhetoric is hollow becomes obvious when regional political leaders express fear over pulling away from their closest ally and supplier. The truth is, America needs Canada far more than it lets on. Violence isn't required. Nature often skips the headline. But the U.S. economy and national security would choke without Canadian resources. Ford's warning and the limits of tariff power Ontario. Premier Doug Ford has torn through the noise with a clear, unvarnished message. This is not just diplomatic posturing. This is a matter of national survival strategy. His remarks defend not only Canada's sovereignty, but implicitly warn the United States. Canada holds leverage that won't be solved by rhetoric or ultimatums. After Ford's public comments, Canadians have begun exercising economic leverage of their own. Polling shows that nearly half of Canadians believe retail boycotts may persist beyond Trump's presidency, with 16% viewing them as permanent. Meanwhile, 66% say they are now less likely to purchase vehicles from automakers that shift jobs out of Canada. This is not symbolic. It's not just who Canadians claim to support, it's what they choose to buy. This growing economic nationalism reflects a shift in national identity, where loyalty and resilience are expressed through consumer behavior as much as through ballot boxes. Systemic neglect meets political theater. Behind every new Trump tariff or threatening letter lies a pattern, a deep-seated need to master cross-border leverage, pressure national negotiators, and weaponize uncertainty. This isn't trade policy, it's political theater. Even former advisors admit the tariffs are less about trade fairness and more about manufacturing urgency, sending rules-laced letters just days before deadlines to force Canada's hand. The reality is sobering. Washington's threats are not emergency measures, but tests of submission. Logic sacrificed for dominance. What should be rule-based negotiation becomes hostage diplomacy. And yet, Canada's leadership knows that conceding now only invites more demands and more threats later. What's primary, legal ground or political theater? The U.S. Supreme Court is now asked to adjudicate whether Trump's executive authority to impose tariffs holds up to legal scrutiny. The outcome will be decisive, not just for immediate trade policy, but for the legitimacy of global rule-based systems. If the court strikes down the executive orders, Canada gains legal validation and leverage. If it upholds them, Canada will have to pivot fast to WTO arbitration, diplomatic mobilization, and rapid diversification of trading partners. But in either scenario, time is short. Officials publicly suggest that a deal by July 21st, or earlier, or before August 1st, is unlikely, echoing internal skepticism that such deadlines are unrealistic. More concerning, perhaps, is that even seasoned trade negotiators warn 11 days is not enough time to reverse an economic storm. With internal pressure mounting from sectors like agriculture, telecom, and digital services, Prime Minister Mark Carney's optimism stands increasingly challenged. Weaponizing sunset clauses. From flexibility to fear. One less discussed flashpoint is the treatment of sunset provisions in trade agreements. The scheduled reviews meant to refine and update treaty terms every 6 years. Originally intended for fine-tuning, these clauses have now become political weapons. Trump praised the agreement when it served his purposes. But now, facing domestic criticism, he labels it unfair, switches tone, and twists the sunset clause into a political gun to Canada's head. The result? A mechanism once designed for flexibility now creates perpetual vulnerability and yields ambiguity instead of stability. Broader patterns. Picking old grievances and repackaging them. Trump's trade campaign doesn't target contemporary trade discrepancies alone. It unearths grievances dating back decades. Digital services taxes, telecom restrictions that block U.S. telecom entry, and supply management systems in agriculture appear on the complaints list, many of them inherited from the Clinton era. What's striking is the selective application. Canada is accused of stubborn policies that were previously tolerated or negotiated. Now, under the veneer of renewed urgency, these old irritants serve as bargaining chips to push Canada toward compliance. This approach treats policy not as a conversation, but as coercion. Tear down protective systems because control matters more than trade integrity. Industrial migration. Tariffs as a weaponized funnel. Tariffs aren't simply economic obstacles. They're a forcing function aimed at shifting Canadian industrial capacity to the U.S. The 35% tariff becomes a funnel. Produce in Canada, pay heavy tariffs, lose profit margin, relocate to U.S. to escape penalties and gain faster approvals. The implied promise of fast-track approvals for firms willing to relocate turns the rhetoric into a disguised real estate pitch. Pay up or move, with Trump casting himself as benevolent broker. The hidden goal is industrial colonization, not job creation, hollowing out Canadian factories and siphoning off skilled labor and capital for American gain. Domestic fallout, communities at risk. Once a factory closes, it rarely returns. In Canada, communities built around singular industries, auto plants in Ontario, potash operations in Saskatchewan, farming towns, face potentially permanent collapse. Beyond the immediate economic harm, there's a ripple effect across housing, healthcare, taxation, and social cohesion. Trump's strategy doesn't destroy infrastructure with bombs. It quietly bulldozes it through fear. The displacement of corporate headquarters, manufacturing plants, and export logistics could induce long-term damage that no short-term rebound can repair. The real-time feedback loop tariffs might take time to show effect in domestic prices, but delays erode confidence. As inflation edges upwards in the U.S., consumers and businesses feel the pinch. Rising input costs, supply chain disruptions, and uncertainty all feed unpredictability. Governors, regardless of party, whisper that the U.S. may not absorb this indefinitely, and that America's vulnerability grows as Canadian resistance strengthens. Those quietly aligned with Canada reinforce that the damage isn't isolated. Retaliatory measures affect both sides, and prolonged disruption could tip the balance back onto American suppliers and markets. Political fallout. A cross-country press conference. On the Canadian side, political strata from across provinces are heating up. Bloc Québécois leader François-Xavier François sharply criticizes Prime Minister Carney for being too oil-focused and insufficiently diversified. The bloc highlights concerns over over-reliance on fossil fuel exports to the U.S. and argues that domestic leaders must prepare backup plans in manufacturing, innovation, and renewable sectors. These internal political forces mean Canada's leadership doesn't just negotiate externally, they must also reconcile rising domestic criticism. Supply management as a societal contract supply management for Quebec's dairy, poultry, and eggs remains integral to rural stability, price consistency, and national identity. It's widely supported, especially in its heartland, even though critics argue it's outdated. Now, Trump targets it, not because Canada asked for change, but because it gives him leverage. Threatening to dismantle supply management isn't just economic. It's a challenge to a national contract that ties communities and sovereignty together. Concessions in this area are not just a trade policy surrender, they're cultural capitulations. The urgency of diversification. Rather than hoping for relief from Washington, Canada's survival pathway lies in strategic diversification. Rapidly expanding trade with the European Union, accelerating links via CETA and potential upgrades, increasing presence in the Asia-Pacific, and reaffirming leadership within the WTO and multilateral systems. These steps aren't idealistic. They are essential protective measures and political signals. Canada must mobilize businesses to accelerate border certifications like COSMA compliance, facilitate fast-track logistics to EU ports, and cultivate alternative supplier relationships to limit reliance on the U.S. market. A deadline that masks a turning point. Multiple sources point to August 1st as a critical threshold, but even this seems predicated more on political optics than realistic timelines. Comments from U.S. administration heads say a deal may come by August 1st, but also acknowledge extreme pressure and limited wiggle room. Carney's willingness to negotiate must be anchored in realism. Fear is not strategy. If the deal doesn't materialize by late July or early August, Canada must shift from negotiation postures to pivot readiness, prepare to reject ultimatums, file WTO claims, boost official EU-Asia dossiers, and publicly rally Canadian-American sympathizers to keep pressure internally on Washington. The role of the Supreme Court and legitimacy. The U.S. Supreme Court decision will shape not only legal but symbolic legitimacy. Should the court reject Trump's executive power to issue blanket tariffs, that outcome strengthens rule-based commerce and weakens arbitrary trade tactics. If the court upholds them, Canada still has tools: proactive WTO filings, quasi-legal challenges, and alliance-based pressure. But any victory depends on unified, forward-leaning strategy, not retreat. Mobilization over negotiation. At this juncture, Carney must pivot from reactive negotiation to proactive mobilization. That means federal, provincial, and industry coordination. Align messaging across provinces. Ontario jeans to auto, Saskatchewan to potash, uranium, Quebec to agriculture and telecom. Consumer awareness campaigns. Encourage Canadians to support domestic manufacturers and avoid brands complicit with offshoring or acquiescence. Global outreach. Engage EU, ASEAN, UK, and WTO allies. Remind them that the broader stakes transcend bilateral trade. Economic defense funds, supply chain hedging, contingency export financing, and upskilling displaced workers. Public messaging on sovereignty. Reframe the debate. It's not protectionism, it's survival, defiance, and global leadership. The stakes, a test of global economic resilience. This struggle is not a bilateral spat. It's a vulnerability test for the entire global economy. Trump's tariffs, strategic threat letters, and unilateral pressure challenge the premise of predictable trade frameworks. If arbitrary power is respected in one case, it sets a dangerous precedent. Every agreement becomes contingent on political whim. Canada's response, whether it succumbs to intimidation or refuses to blink, will resonate well beyond its borders. It will define whether rule-based systems continue to matter, or whether global commerce becomes hostage to fluctuating political PR. Conclusion: standing tall or retreating. This is more than a trade war. It's a reckoning. Canada has reached a turning point. With lives at stake, industries under siege, and alliances faltering, the time for half measures is over. Trump's strategy of chaos has shaken global confidence and forced countries like Canada to reinvent themselves in real time. Yet through the noise, Canada is emerging with clarity. Not with anger, but with resolve. Not with panic, but with purpose. The message is no longer whispered behind closed doors. It is spoken plainly now. Canada will not be intimidated. It will not be broken. And it will not be bullied into abandoning its values. Trump may crave spectacle, but Canada is building strength, quietly, patiently, and powerfully. Trump isn't building anything. He's burning. Not through bombs, but with uncertainty. Not through missiles, but through altered trade flows and shattered expectations. Carney's moment is either surrender or stewardship. Beneath the aggression lies a hidden fact. Canada's structural strength, supply chains, and global alliances matter more than Canada's paralysis would allow. If Carney acts swiftly, decisively, and publicly, mobilizing consumers, diversifying trade routes, spurring innovation, and refusing to compromise core national policies, Canada won't just survive. It can redefine what fairness, resilience, and global leadership look like. But only if the nation stands shoulder to shoulder. Provinces, industries, workers, and consumers. Because when unity becomes strategy, no executive order or tariff threat can dismantle a country that refuses to surrender.